Do you feel invisible sometimes?
I don't so much feel invisible as on occasion I want to be invisible. Suddenly I found myself on the wrong end of a layoff. And after being in this industry for, at that time, almost 30 years, it was quite a shock to suddenly be outside looking in. Now suddenly I had nothing but time, living alone in isolation, in lockdown in an apartment. And I really thought about all of the different options that I could have. I realized that life can be enjoyed even without that quest for having ever more. Have a more, modest existence in a smaller square foot place, not trying to surround yourself with things that you want to remind you of your status.
That was former Volvo executive John Jorn Stech. He spent nearly 3 decades climbing the corporate ladder in the auto industry. He made it to the top, but then suddenly, at 53, he was laid off. This unexpected turn opened the door to a completely different way of life, a modest life built around simplicity, freedom, and perhaps, most importantly, finally having the time for himself. Welcome to the X Perspective podcast, where curiosity leads us to explore how environment and culture shape an individual's psychology. We ultimately aim to understand the human condition through the personal stories of our guests from diverse cultures around the world. I'm your host, Raj, and this is episode 27 of the X Perspective podcast. This episode is not just a personal story about a successful executive who got laid off at 53. There's a much deeper thread running through John's story. It's a story about what happens when you let go of the prescribed idea of how life is supposed to be lived, an idea shaped by your culture and passed down through generations. In this episode, American-German expat John reveals how he stepped away from the rat race in the United States and eventually discovered the beauty of a more modest lifestyle abroad. It's also a story about recognizing that sometimes what appears to be a setback is actually an opportunity in disguise. You just have to be willing to see it. Now join me and let's find out how John did just that. John, you were born in Germany, and then by the age of 3, you moved to the United States with your parents who are German. Now tell me, growing up in America, what did you come to believe a successful life looked like in American culture?
Go to school, you study, you get good grades, you try, then you go to university, you study, you get good grades, then you work, you find a job. And in the case of my father and grandfather, they worked for the same employer for decades. And they invested an entire career with their companies. And that was the model in the 1970s, 1980s. That's what you saw. And that's what I thought my path would be. People didn't talk about becoming an entrepreneur back then. Some people did it, but that wasn't talked about like it is today.
So you thought that was a path that you should follow. So tell me, how did you follow it? I
did exactly as I prescribed. So I went to school. I learned, of course, English and German simultaneously as I was growing up. I got good grades. And from there, just going to university ultimately, studying in the science field, and having the plan to graduate and go into a career in a large organization, much like my grandfather, much like my father did, and much like I saw many of my friends' parents doing as well.
So how many years did you spend in your life working up the corporate ladder? Because that's what you did, right?
I did. So I graduated from university. I worked in chemistry, which I studied in the university. I worked in chemistry for about 2 years, and I realized that unless I have infinitely more, degrees with a master's and a PhD, that I wouldn't really be able to go into an international career route, because that's what I truly wanted, was to have a career where I could develop and then, have a career that would take me around the world in one form or another. And so I studied chemistry, didn't really like it, and I took some business classes in my free time, and it was like a fish going back into the water, and it felt so natural. And when I did graduate with a master's in business, I got into the automotive industry by accident, and there was no turning back. I ended up having a career in the automotive industry that was about 27 years long, and it still continues today, now, over 30 years, but as an independent consultant.
Why did you find that it was important while growing up in America that you follow this path that was laid out for you?
In the 70s and 80s, I would say that's what people did. There was seemingly this, I guess, a contract between the employee and the employer that was, it was unwritten, that you dedicate your life to the company and they keep you for the duration of your career. And there was a certain safety net, and there were things like pensions and again, it was an unwritten contract. And it seemed like something safe, and it seemed like something that you could rely on and literally take to the bank.
John, talk to me about how much of an importance was it for you to be the financial provider? How much of that was motivating you to follow this path?
So I grew up in what I would call a more traditional household, where my father worked and he provided for the family, and my mother, she stayed home with the children. I have a sister, and so she stayed home and she took care of my sister and me. Once we got to a certain age in high school where we were more independent, then she decided to also go out and work. And then if I look, a generation back, my grandmother actually never really worked. My grandfather always provided for the family, the house and the cars and the food and so on.
How important was it for you, though, to do this role, which is be the financial provider? Like, how much of the culture you were growing up made you feel as a man that you needed to do this?
It felt like that was everything. That was everything. That was what I saw in my family, on both sides of my family. And that's also what I saw among the families of my friends. So it seemed like that was in the 70s and 80s and going into the 1990s, that seemed to be what you do as a man to provide. It was part of the cultural grain.
Did you ever question it?
Not really. I always figured that I could be the provider. I was never against a spouse working. I'm married for a second time now, and my first spouse, with her, I had my 2 children, and we decided jointly that she was actually going to stay home and raise the children, and that I would become the sole provider, which meant then that I had to develop my career in such a way that it would allow, in a country where costs were rising, that I could develop a career where we could have a good life with only a single income stream.
As you continued to climb the corporate ladder, John, how much of your identity became tied to your work?
That's a great question. I'm going to have to say too much. I worked in the automotive industry for some really captivating brands: Mercedes-Benz, Jeep, Dodge, Volvo. And I loved cars. As a kid, I was probably 2-3 years old, and my mother would take me through a parking lot in Frankenthal, Germany, where I was born. And I could point out the brand of every car in the parking lot. So from the youngest age, I was a complete car enthusiast. And working in the auto industry, it kind of merged my career into what I was passionate about. So it was too easy to rise up through the ranks in the automotive industry, to be able to drive really cool cars, to drive test vehicles. It was so easy for my personal being to be kind of merged into what the job entailed.
That's amazing. And earlier you said that you fell into this industry accidentally?
I did. I was in the student government at the University of New Hampshire in their graduate school program. And I was invited to come to a lunch with the trustees of the university. And then we sat in this lunchroom in a very nice area of the university. And directly next to me was a gentleman. He was Scottish. He was a PhD chemist. And we hit it off. We talked about European things. We talked about chemistry. We talked about where the industry was going. And then he told me that he was the CEO of one of the largest interior trim manufacturers for the auto industry in North America. And they happened to be located with their headquarters right there, maybe 10 miles away from the university.
Wow.
And ultimately, that summer was it was a recession in the United States in the early 1990s, and there were no jobs. Companies were laying off tens of thousands of workers. They were certainly not going to hire an intern. But this gentleman, he invited me on Monday. This was on a Friday. 3 days later, come to his office, put on a suit and tie, he told me, and tell me what area of the company you want to work in. Sales, marketing, engineering, you tell me. I went, I worked as a sales and marketing intern for a year, and then they hired me straight out of the university after that. And that was how I absolutely accidentally fell into the automotive industry.
John, what would you say that you sacrificed along the way when you continued to pursue your career goals?
Because I had made the decision jointly with my spouse at the time, with my children in mind, I sacrificed time. I threw myself 100% into the job, and I always made sure that I was the one who was going to get that next promotion. Just by performing well, bringing the results, always overperforming versus what was expected of me. And that required being away from home a lot. It required traveling a lot. I remember working for Mercedes-Benz, and I think for a period of 6 years, I think I missed all but one Thanksgiving in the United States because the company always had an annual meeting at the Thanksgiving time.
Wow.
So those were the sacrifices. And I would say, if the next question is, do I regret that sacrifice? I would say sometimes yes, because I missed a lot of the growing up of my children.
Okay, John, in 2020 at 53, you experienced a major turning point in your life. What happened?
Yes, this was something where the rug was pulled out from under my feet. All those years of efforts and performing as best I could at work, suddenly I found myself on the wrong end of a layoff. The company did a big restructuring following, let's say, overspend on their electric vehicle and autonomous vehicle programs, and people paid the price. People paid the price by being restructured out of the company. And after being in this industry for, at that time, almost 30 years, it was quite a shock to suddenly be outside looking in.
I was going to ask you, when you got laid off, what do you think that you lost other than a paycheck?
The first thing that I would say that I lost, there were several things that strike me still today, and I'm still discovering them even 6 years after the fact. The first thing that I would say was just a hit to the identity.
Sorry, a hit to what?
To my identity. My identity was so tied up in being in that business, in that type of role, that it was difficult to suddenly not be there. Now, I did make the assumption that I would get back in somehow in the beginning. That was what I was thinking. The other thing that over time that I realized that I really miss, and at that time I didn't miss it right away because I assumed that I was going to go back into a corporate environment, was working with people, leading a team. I loved doing it. And I've been told many times, and I don't say this in a bragging way, but I was told so often that I was the best leader that people in Latin America or in Europe or in Egypt ever had, where I had lived before, even in Russia. And it's hard to please the Russians. But I really miss working with people and working with a team towards a common goal, solving their problems, their personal problems, and letting those problems, just dissipate so that we can focus on what needs to actually be done as a team.
So, John, you just told me that you faced an identity crisis at this point and you missed leadership. Months following your layoff, describe to me what you went through.
I made the assumption that I was going to find another good, interesting, maybe even a little bit different role in the future, maybe a different mobility company. But unfortunately, 2 months after my layoff, COVID came and the lockdowns came and the job market basically completely evaporated. There was no job market for at least a year after I got laid off.
So what did you go through during those months?
I realized that the worst enemy I had would be idleness, especially the brain. So I made the decision to keep myself as educated and tuned in to the industry as possible so that I would not be cold if and when I would find a new role. And it wasn't really until later when I came to a different conclusion of what do I really want to do that I finally had to cope with the fact that my identity tied to being an executive in the auto industry had to be changed. And I had to go through that kind of grief cycle of grieving that one thing had ended and something else was going to now come into place.
Yeah, that's what I was trying to understand is how do you do that? It has been cemented in your mind for so long, this identity that you're an executive and you've worked so hard your whole life to get to the top. And then it's taken away from you. How do you tell yourself, okay, this is no longer who I am?
I made the decision after about a year of looking around and looking at the job market, which was still non-existent. I woke up one morning and I had 3 emails in my inbox, and all 3 of them were asking me to employ my knowledge to consult on a different project. And it wasn't 3 emails in a week. It wasn't 3 emails in a month. It was 3 emails overnight, all on the same morning, waking up and finding them. And all of them were related to my past experience in the auto industry internationally, not in the United States. And that started to get me thinking. If I can be asked, I wasn't even marketing myself, to somehow utilize what I had learned, maybe there was a different path that I could take. One of the other things that I've struggled with over the last 6 years after leaving my last employer is I was always the youngest leader. I mean, I ran a company operation in Egypt at the age of 39. And then when I left my last employment, I was in my early 50s. I mean, not that long after, 14 years. And I suddenly realized that at the mid 50s in the United States, they don't really want you back. They don't necessarily, want a person in their mid 50s. They would rather have 2 less expensive employees than having one person who's more expensive. And this came to light to me when I was applying to one company in the mobility space. And here I am in my mid 50s and I was being asked for my university transcript. And who asks for a university transcript of somebody in their 50s? I mean, there's enough life experience that invalidates anything that I would have had in my transcript, 30 years before. So it was another thing that I had to deal with was my personal, aging and getting into my 50s and understanding that the world doesn't necessarily want you in the corporate space. And that was part of the ingredients that helped me to make the decision to take this more independent lifestyle where I can pick what I want to do, what I want to focus on, and where I want to steer it. And that's actually now become a little bit of a passion project of mine, is from what I learned going through all of this challenge and identity issues and being a provider. Right now, so many companies are laying off so many people in their 50s that I made a conscious decision to try to help and to do something about that.
And how do you help people?
So I used all of the lessons that I learned 6 years ago. I had a terrible resume or CV. I had a horribly structured LinkedIn page, and I was really bad at the interview process because I hadn't had to do that for decades. And what I've done is I've actually created now a platform, a channel called Ageism Survival Guide. And I use that to kind of convey what I learned, those lessons, and also the thinking process, not just the resume and the LinkedIn page, but how to make it through, psychologically, this change in your life, and to, navigate through that. It's painful. And people who spend 30 years in a company and suddenly get laid off, they don't know what to do to find another job, or what are the alternatives to finding a job. And I've gone through that. It was sometimes elating and sometimes it was very painful, but I'm channeling my learnings of the last 6 years into a platform that helps other people navigate that. And hopefully they don't have to have the same experience I did.
Before getting laid off, did you feel you were successful?
I knew actually that I was successful. The numbers said it. The KPIs said it, just to use some corporate speak there. And the people that I had worked with had said it. The people that I worked with, they said how they, enjoyed to work with me, how I was a very talented leader, and how they were shocked that a company, even in a bigger restructuring, could let someone go. So I knew I was a person of value in that environment, and it was a challenge to, put my arms around ultimately why that would happen, and that of course impacted my feeling of value over time. It would kind of eat at me a little bit, along with losing that status as a provider on the personal side.
Did you feel you were successful at life at this point before you got laid off?
I thought very much that I was successful. I had have two fantastic children, who are now 27 and 24. One just, got her MD a month ago. And so my son is also very successful in what he does, and also in business. So I think if that's the measure of success, is what your offspring are doing, then I feel that I am extremely successful in life.
Okay, John, how much do you think the American culture encourages people to believe that their worth as a person depends on how successful they are in their careers?
I think that's almost a cornerstone in a way. It's in a way locked in with the fundamental American dream that you are successful. You can come from anything, you can come from nothing, and you can grow into something. And that growing into something usually meant that you were financially independent, that you could buy a house, that you would have children, and then the assumption was that your children will eventually have a better life than you do. And that was all kind of that American dream cornerstone. You marry that together with the feeling of responsibility that you have as a German, because we were supposed to be responsible. And that kind of drove me in my personality for my quest on how I wanted to structure my life.
Do you think Americans tie identity to work more than some other cultures?
I think they do in different ways. I think they certainly hand over more time to their employer. You have actual working contracts that are signed for 35 hours, 40 hours in other countries, in almost every other country. But in the US, you do not have work contracts. And some people are always shocked to learn that, if they're not in the United States, that you don't have an actual contract signed with your employer. It's an at-will work. And so that also doesn't limit the number of hours that you work. So if you're in white collar work, right, in an office, you can work almost infinitely, and they don't necessarily pay you overtime for this. So on a time basis, you're identified very close to work, what you give to your employer, and then I think people carry that home. They carry that home with them as well, and it's like a badge of honor almost. That you were up at 5 o'clock in the morning doing your emails, or you're up at midnight doing your email. It's something that I think almost like the sacrifice is this badge of honor that people wear. And I think that's truly American. Whereas in other countries, you're striving for a 32-hour work week or a 35-hour work week. And people really try to separate their work from their home and claim some of their personal life and personal time.
Based on your experience, would you say that in America, if you take a vacation, is it frowned upon?
Well, first of all, a vacation in the United States, many people don't have more than 10 days of vacation time. And so until you're a more senior person, you get 10 days. I at the end of my career with a corporate entity, I had 5 weeks of vacation time, and I used very little of it, mostly because my responsibilities were so high. My schedule simply didn't allow for vacation times. But Americans and vacation, that's an interesting one. In Germany, people take their full 6 weeks. Sometimes, in a straight succession of a 6-week holiday, traveling abroad or traveling somewhere. And I think that's also where the critique of American society comes from, that Americans don't travel abroad because 10 days of vacation don't allow you to do that.
So you can't help but think that their identity is tied so deeply with their work when they're spending so much of their time at work.
I think it's almost forced in a way. The circumstances drive that. And then if you work for something like I did, I was very fortunate. I worked with something that I was very passionate about. But if other people work with something that they're also quite passionate about, then I think, yes, it makes it that much more of a slippery slope to spend more time, to be proud of it, and to wear that extra time that you spend there as your badge of honor.
John, had you experienced the same job loss in a different country? Do you think it would have affected you differently?
I think because of my just way I see the world and the way that I saw my family circle, that I would have reacted the same regardless. It doesn't matter where I would have been on the planet. I would have felt the same way, that I was losing something that was part of my identity, and part of that identity, was the role itself, but then the role of the provider and the provider to my family. Losing those two things would have been homogeneous in any part of the world that I had the same experience.
You have been living in Thailand, John, for about 3 years. What beliefs about success felt universal truths when you were an executive, but now seem like products of the environment you grew up in?
It was always kind of the striving for promotion and more salary. It was always this more. And I realized that was part of the corporate hamster wheel that you jump onto. You go in there and you realize you have to keep running faster than the people who are right behind you on your heels in order to outperform them, in order to get the next promotion, in order to get the next salary bump. And when you pull yourself out of that and you realize, now working as a consultant and working on some other side work, I realized that life can be enjoyed even without that quest for having ever more. That you can have a more modest existence in a smaller square foot place, not trying to surround yourself with things that you want to remind you of your status. You don't need that. And I think that is the biggest learning I have, that I started learning almost 20 years ago when I worked in Egypt. But now I know exactly what those feelings were 20 years ago, that life can be fantastic on a simpler basis.
John, when you look back now, If you were starting all over again before you entered the corporate world, everything you've learned up to this point, would your definition of what a good life or a successful life is like, would it have changed in any way today?
Of course, hindsight is 2020. And if I knew then what I knew today, starting with that big bang of layoffs in 1991, 1992, during the recession in the United States, I would have seen the red flag that presented, that everything that you thought was safe and sacred in that unwritten contract of employment, I would have realized that was actually a farce, and it would become more and more of a farce over time. So I still clung on to the belief that I had to work in a corporate type environment for many years, whereas I should have earlier started making a transition, working for myself in some type of way.
Do you think that you only came to this conclusion because you finally were able to get out of that environment and get some distance?
I think the answer to that is yes. The decision to stay in the corporate environment, I had dabbled in the idea of becoming an entrepreneur before, but then I looked at the fact that I had two young children, and they were very, very intelligent, and I knew that they would go to university, and I also knew what university costs in the United States, and I would have to save immeasurable amounts of money to be able to send them to the university. I felt it was my responsibility to pay for their undergraduate school, for their undergraduate education. And so it was that fear of not being able to replicate that type of an income as an entrepreneur during that critical time when the children were nearing the university age, that fear kept me in that corporate environment, kind of a slave to that corporate hamster wheel that I mentioned before.
Because your identity was tied to being the provider.
Correct. I made that pact. It was a pact, actually, that was pretty much made with my father as well. He paid for my university with the kind of unwritten, handshake agreement that that's what I'm going to turn around, and I'm going to do that for my children. And that was what I believed in. And I made that commitment, and I was going to fulfill that commitment. And I saw that taking the risky decision of becoming an entrepreneur just before the children were ready to go to the university was too risky of a decision.
Oh, I didn't know that's what you were thinking. You were thinking about becoming an entrepreneur back then. That's interesting.
It was a thought. And then certainly the layoff, the restructuring, the 1 year of COVID, and having more than enough time to think about it. Because that was another thing that I never had before was
Right.
time. I had no time. I was constantly on a schedule, on conference calls, flying around Latin America for my job. And now suddenly I had nothing but time, living alone in isolation, in lockdown in an apartment. And I really thought about all of the different options that I could have. And by that point in time, my children were actually in university. I did actually save the money. Mission accomplished there.
John, do you still, at least sometimes, define success using the American culture standards?
I do. I'm trying to get rid of it. I have to admit, but it's difficult because it's something that's so ingrained in, and it's I'm 59 years old, and it's not easy to get that out of my DNA level. So I still measure that, and I look at my success in my consulting or in my podcasting. I still measure it by a financial yardstick, and I shouldn't. I should look at it more from an enjoyment perspective or a growth perspective, but unfortunately, that's a KPI that I just can't let go of.
What was the most difficult thing about letting go of your former identity?
I think it's a combination of things, which I'd mentioned before. Part of it is that having and leading a team was so close to me, and it was something that was just so part of me because I love to do it. And then simultaneously losing that and losing, at least for a period of time, the ability to provide, at all while being on hold. those two things were pretty crushing. And it was something that I didn't in the moment, as it dawned on me that it's a life that I had that's not going to come back. Even when I made the conscious choice to go into consulting, I had to know that those things are not coming back. But it still, on certain occasions, hurts to see, 1,000 LinkedIn posts where people are standing there with their team that they've just accomplished something, and I miss that. I have to say, I do miss that. That's something that I love to celebrate when a team that I had would have a moment of success.
This is a tough question, John. Do you feel invisible sometimes?
I don't so much feel invisible as on occasion I want to be invisible. So what I mean by that is based on my history, on what I have done, what I'm still doing today, I'm very, very lucky to have a very strong network in the auto industry. And people seek me out still for that. But there are times when I went through, I would say, almost the darkest days of not feeling that I could provide to a family, and not having the ability to be part of something, but just working alone and never being a part of a team anymore. That I wanted to be invisible. I thought I kind of lost the game, and what's the point now? But then I wake up and I realize that I am being sought out for my expertise, for my knowledge, for what I've done in the past, and I just remind myself, no, you shouldn't be invisible. You should actually stand up and be proud of this, of being a person who has reinvented himself, relatively late in life, and done so relatively successfully with learning many new skills that I never would have thought I had 10 years ago.
Was that transition difficult?
It was. It's something that I think I still go through today. There are certain things that trigger, my old life versus what I do today. Right, being a consultant or a podcaster, you can't rely on your income. It's like a sawtooth pattern, and there's not a regular paycheck that shows up in your bank account at the end of the month. So, looking into my checking account, that can be a trigger if nothing has landed for a while. It can be a trigger when I see, a friend, a colleague of mine who is celebrating something of a success of a big project being completed. Those are things that kind of trigger those deep innermost feelings that I've been trying to conquest and trying to get over. But every now and then something triggers that, and I feel this, this urge to have that again.
How much of being here in Thailand is helping you to move forward in your new direction?
It helps me a lot to be out of that actual environment. And I think it's been quite therapeutic to be here and to live in a country where the culture, even influenced by Buddhism, has different focuses. And people approach their life and what they have and what they want in a different way. So being back in the US, I was of course constantly faced with people having to have more, the summer homes, the huge sprawling McMansions, as they call them in the US, and just always having more. The most relieving thing that my wife and I now have done in the last 3 years was to clear out a storage unit that was about 3 by 5 meters and get rid of everything. It was so liberating to get rid of our old stuff and to basically start fresh.
John, doesn't it get tiring, this rat race? Someone's buying a summer house and then someone buys a car. Like, doesn't that feel so exhausting, or does it feel exciting when you're in it?
To be very honest, I never wanted a summer house. I would rather have spent the money on travel.
On travel?
No, on travel.
Okay.
I always wanted to see the world. So I I would always prioritize, travel somewhere new and seeing something different than to invest it in a house where you're forced to go every single summer and stay there the entire time and never see anything new.
I am on the same page with that. I'd rather go out and see different environments. If you had never been laid off and continued working in the corporate world, what do you think your life would look like today?
I probably would just be running around on that corporate hamster wheel. Like I said, I'm 59. I still am quite full of energy. I could imagine that, I would have even considered retirement 6 years from now at the age of 65, which is kind of the average age in the United States. I probably would have just done the same. And I would have most likely liked it, again, because I love the environment of leading people and so on. And there's that drug of the monthly paycheck that you get used to, knowing that, month in, month out, you have a good month, you have a bad month, it's still going to land in your bank account. And it would have been a good life like that. But if you ask me the next question, which is, would I want to go back? The answer is no. I actually do value my freedom and being able to pick and choose what I want to do, as opposed to getting, the assignments handed down from up above.
Looking back, do you think that you were pursuing your own definition of success or the one that you inherited from the culture around you?
I believe that I was mostly striving for something that was defined for me by my environment that I grew up in. But I did identify with that. I mean, I identified with the fact that, a parent's job is to basically successfully raise the children, to get them educated, and to get them successfully started in their own lives. Mm-hmm. And that mission, I think, was absolutely accomplished. So if that's the success, then absolutely it has been achieved.
If you were offered an executive position at a car company in America now, would you take it?
I can very quickly and clearly answer that question by saying no. And the reason for that is I've become very fond of having my schedule the way I want to form it, to have the type of clients and the type of projects in the fields and the areas that I like. And it also, I would not be able to have my own podcast, which I love. I love doing it. If I were still working in the corporate environment, I simply wouldn't have the time, or to be honest, based on the subject, I wouldn't have the allowance to do that particular podcast.
You told me earlier that one of your dreams, your childhood dreams, was to own a Porsche. Am I correct?
That is correct. Actually, yesterday, I by accident discovered in my vast digital library a photograph of the first plastic model that I built myself, any model, and it was a Porsche 911. It has been just my personal hobby, my personal passion for years. This was at the age of, I think, 8 or 9 when I built that. So, I mean, this is not something that was associated with status or with the brand or that it's an expensive car. I didn't even know any of it. I just loved the shape of it. It's so iconic. Going back to the cycle of life, which is, you work, you provide for the family, you send the kids to college, and then in your 50s, you reach what's typically thought of as the peak earning years, at least in the United States. And I thought, that's going to be the time. That's going to be the time. My children, university, out of the house. That's when I'll be able to, buy my Porsche, which I've been passionate about all of my life. Again, independent of the status of the vehicle or anything like this. And of course, as an independent consultant, with a sawtooth income pattern and not a structured income on a regular basis, it's something that it's probably not going to happen anymore. And it's something that I also have to accept, is that this was a dream I had most of my life, which, as shallow as it sounds, it's something that I have to give up.
But if I was to offer you a job right now where you would be able to get this Porsche and the paycheck, You would still not take it?
I would still not take it. I enjoy my life now. I enjoy my life the way it is. I enjoy my schedule. I enjoy living in a different country that's not a country of my own. For me, the bigger challenge right now is actually just learning a new culture, learning a new language. Last evening I had Thai lesson number 36, and I love learning this language, even though it's extremely difficult. But I love that, and I don't want to go back to something that I found afterwards is not as attractive as it seems. I think I've likened it a little bit to like the Matrix movies, where you kind of wake up and you realize, hey, wait a minute, that life I had actually isn't as good as it felt when I was in it. There are other things out there where you can have more independence that makes life a little bit more interesting.
And John, would you say again, you only realized this once you left America and you saw it from a distance, what you just said, that you can have a different life and still be happy?
I think that certainly helped, because it's a different perspective. You see a different way of life. You see how people live differently, and it kind of triggers these thoughts on, why do we have to have all that stuff in the United States? Right? As I mentioned, it was great to purge all of our belongings, and I don't need that. And I appreciate more the experiences and the life here than I do having all that stuff that I never touch, I never use, and it's just good to be rid of it and to experience life instead.
Do you ever feel like it's hard to take your foot off the accelerator and hit the brakes for a moment, just to reflect on what's driving you in life? Have you ever wondered if there are other roads you could take instead of the one everyone around you seems to be traveling? Or are you so engrossed in the rat race that you simply don't have the time to think about these things? I love these car metaphors, so here's another one. Sometimes it takes a roadblock to bring your car to a complete stop. And that roadblock can give you the opportunity to pause, look around, and perhaps even see an alternative route. Maybe even a more promising one, like John did. As of today, it's been about 4 years since John left the United States with his wife. They now live in Bangkok and enjoy a modest life together. When John is not busy traveling or photographing cars, he is hard at work producing his Ageism Survival Guide podcast. Have a listen. The link is in the description. Thanks so much for your attention and time. If you've enjoyed this episode, please consider supporting us on Patreon or buying us a Thai milk tea. You can visit the X Perspective podcast website for more information. There are also links in the description section. Your support helps us keep sharing meaningful stories. And please don't forget to subscribe so you'll be notified whenever a new episode drops. Ever get to the end of the month and wonder where all your money went? Well, now there's a free app called Enough Spent. You open it, type what you spent, and you're done. Your coffee won't even get cold. It works in over 150 currencies, which is great if you're traveling, and it works offline too. No account needed, no sign up. If you've ever wanted to track your spending without dealing with some complicated finance app, search for Enough Spent on Google Play. And remember, every perspective creates a story. What's yours? See you in episode 28.